When I first moved into Willow Creek Estates, I thought I had found the perfect place to start fresh after a messy divorce. Quiet, tree-lined streets, large lots, and a sparkling lake at the end of the cul-de-sac where my house sat, a sturdy, craftsman-style home with a wraparound porch and enough space for my woodworking hobby. I'd bought it outright with my settlement money, which meant no mortgage, and I planned to live quietly, minding my own business. But Willow Creek had an HOA, and as I would soon find out, that HOA was ruled with an iron fist by none other than Karen Holloway, a woman in her late 50s who wore pastel cardigans like battle armor and carried a clipboard like it was a sword. At first, her friendly visits seemed harmless enough. She'd show up with printed HOA newsletters and casually mention little rules I might not be aware of, like the height limit for fences or the requirement to get approval before painting my shed. I nodded, thanked her, and ignored most of it. My property was well kept, my grass mowed, and my porch swept, so I figured she'd leave me alone. Oh, how wrong I was. The first real clash came when I built a small pergola in my backyard. It wasn't visible from the street, but Karen appeared at my door the next day claiming it violated architectural guidelines. When I pointed out it wasn't in the bylaws, she sniffed and said the board would review it anyway. I brushed it off, not realizing that this woman took every minor infraction as a personal war. Over the months, she sent me a steady stream of violation letters. Trash can place too early on pickup day, my truck parked in my driveway instead of the garage, my porch light supposedly being too bright. I started keeping a file of her nonsense just in case, though I never thought I'd actually need it. Then came the night that changed everything. It was late autumn, and I had just finished working in my shop when I smelled smoke. At first, I thought maybe a neighbor was burning leaves, but then I heard a faint crackling sound, an unnatural one. I stepped out onto my porch and froze. The side of my house was engulfed in flames, fire climbing up the siding like it had been waiting for the chance. I ran inside, grabbed my phone, and dialed 911 while trying to rescue what I could my grandfather's rifle. A box of old photographs, but the fire was spreading too fast. By the time the fire department arrived, most of my home was gone. The fire chief told me it looked suspicious, like it had been started deliberately near the gas meter. That sent a chill down my spine. The next morning, still dazed and running on coffee and adrenaline, I found a note tucked under the windshield wiper of my truck. Maybe now you'll learn to follow the rules. My stomach turned. There was no signature, but I didn't need one. I'd seen that blocky handwriting before on every violation notice Karen had sent me. I took the note straight to the police, who told me they'd investigate, but I could tell from their tone they weren't hopeful without witnesses or video. What Karen didn't know, though, was that my brother is a private investigator and ex-cop. I called him that night, told him everything, and he immediately started digging. Within a week, he found 2 neighbors willing to talk quietly about how Karen had been boasting at a recent HOA meeting that problem homeowners sometimes learn the hard way. One even recalled her complaining about my eyesore truck and how someone should teach him a lesson. My brother also pulled security cam footage from a house 2 streets over that showed a figure matching Karen's build walking toward my property that night carrying what looked like a gas can. The grainy video wasn't perfect, but it was enough to get the police to take another look. Meanwhile, I was forced to move into a small rental outside the neighborhood while my insurance claim crawled through endless red tape. Karen must have thought she'd won because she didn't even try to hide her smugness, smirking when she saw me driving past, making comments about how some people just aren't a good fit for the community. She had no idea I was quietly building a case against her, and she had even less of an idea that I had a law degree. I'd left the legal field years ago, but I still had my bar license. And the idea started forming in my mind. If the police dragged their feet, I'd take this to civil court myself. The first step was airtight documentation, so I gathered every violation letter, every note, and every statement from neighbors willing to go on record. I got an independent fire investigator to confirm the blaze was arson and that the point of origin matched where Karen had been seen walking. By late spring, I was ready. I filed a lawsuit against Karen personally for arson, destruction of property, and emotional distress, attaching every shred of evidence I had. When the court papers were served, I heard from another neighbor that Karen had turned white as a sheet. She tried to spin it to the HOA, claiming it was harassment and that I was trying to bankrupt her. But most of the board members were too scared of being implicated to back her openly. The best part? The judge assigned to the case was someone I'd clerked for early in my career, a sharp, no-nonsense woman who hated bullies. I didn't mention our past connection, but I could tell she recognized my name. My court date was set for the following week, and that's when the irony hit me. After all her harassment, her threats, and her smug superiority, Karen was going to have to walk into my courtroom and answer for burning my house to the ground. She thought she was untouchable because she ran the HOA, but in the eyes of the law, she was just another defendant. And I was more than ready to make sure she never forgot it. The first week after the fire was a blur of sirens, insurance calls, and interviews with the fire marshal, but beneath the chaos, my mind was laser-focused, not just on rebuilding my home, but on figuring out exactly how Karen thought she could burn me out and get away with it. The smirk she wore when she passed me on the street the next day, like she had won, was all I needed to confirm my suspicion, and if she thought her political pull in the HOA would shield her, she had severely underestimated the fact that I wasn't just any neighbor she could bully. I was a sitting judge in our county courthouse, and my patience for people who abused power was microscopic. I began my own quiet investigation while letting the official channels do their work, digging into HOA meeting minutes and finding an oddly timed budget reallocation 2 months before the fire for emergency community improvement that, conveniently, included funds for demolition of unsafe structures, a designation that had never been applied to my home before. When I cross-referenced the minutes with security footage from my neighbor's driveway camera, the truth began to snap into place. The night before the fire, a black SUV that matched Karen's exactly was parked just a few houses down for over an hour, and though the camera's resolution wasn't crystal clear, the silhouette of the person getting out was unmistakably her. Meanwhile, the fire marshal's preliminary report listed the cause as arson with traces of accelerant consistent with gasoline, something no accidental wiring fault or lightning strike could mimic, and while Karen was parading around the neighborhood telling anyone who'd listened that my home had been a hazard and that the community was better off without it, I was compiling a case file so airtight that even the slickest defense attorney would choke on it. Of course, I couldn't move too fast. In court, appearances matter, and if I came across as vengeful instead of factual, she could spin the narrative to make me look biased. So I played the long game, publicly agreeing that it was a tragedy and keeping my tone neutral while inside I was mapping out exactly how to make her walk straight into my courtroom. The insurance company, for their part, wasn't buying her story either. The adjuster told me off the record that they were considering filing charges for fraud because Karen had been in contact with them 2 weeks before the fire, inquiring about policy transfers for properties under HOA control, which made no sense unless she was expecting my property to somehow become HOA property. While my house was nothing but charred remains, my land was still mine, and in this state, land ownership trumps any HOA claim, something Karen either didn't understand or thought she could circumvent by force. What she didn't realize was that my position as a judge didn't just give me insight into how the system worked. It gave me direct access to legal tools and procedural strategies that most people wouldn't even know existed. So I set up a quiet meeting with the county prosecutor, laid out the evidence I had so far, and explained that while I couldn't preside over the case for conflict of interest reasons, I could ensure the investigation was thorough and that the eventual trial date landed in my court calendar rotation for other cases, which meant Karen would have to stand trial in the very building where my word carried more weight than hers ever could. As the weeks rolled on, the HOA board tried to back her, but cracks started showing, especially when 2 other board members came forward, anonymously to tell investigators that Karen had pitched a plan months ago to acquire my lot and repurpose it as a community event space, claiming she had a way to handle the occupant problem. When confronted, she denied everything, of course, but the statements were recorded and sworn, and I made sure copies went straight into the prosecutor's file. By the time the grand jury convened, the narrative was shifting fast. The local news had picked up whispers of an HOA arson scandal, and though my name was kept out of it officially, people in the community weren't stupid. They knew exactly who the story was about, and the sympathy that had been absent when the fire happened was now flooding in, with neighbors stopping by to offer help, drop off meals, and even offer me guest houses to stay in. I accepted none of it beyond polite thanks, not because I didn't appreciate it, but because I knew this case would be cleaner if I kept my distance from any perception of favoritism or bias. Finally, the day came when the arrest warrant was signed. I was at the courthouse in my chambers when I got the call from a detective friend who simply said, "We've got her." Karen had been taken into custody at her morning HOA meeting right after giving a speech about protecting community standards, which, according to someone who was there, made the entire room erupt in stunned laughter as the handcuffs clicked. The charge sheet was long: arson, destruction of property, conspiracy to commit fraud, and attempted unlawful acquisition of real estate, and while she posted bail that afternoon, her public image was in ruins. The moment I knew I had her right where I wanted her was when her defense attorney filed a motion to have her case moved to another jurisdiction, claiming she couldn't get a fair trial here due to community bias, the judge assigned. To the case denied the motion, citing insufficient evidence of bias, and set the trial date for the following week. Karen didn't know it yet, but that meant she'd be walking into my courtroom, not as a board member lording over rules, not as a neighborhood gossip spinning lies, but as a defendant standing before the bench where I had spent years upholding the law, and I intended to make sure she faced every ounce of accountability the evidence allowed. In the meantime, I quietly authorized the county to place a temporary lien on any HOA accounts that Karen had sole signing authority over, to prevent her from draining funds to pay her legal bills, and that move alone sent the board into panic mode. Suddenly, the same people who had been parroting her lies were scrambling to distance themselves, issuing public statements about full cooperation with authorities and commitment to transparency. By the time the pretrial hearings began, Karen was isolated, broke, and furious, but still trying to act like she had some kind of upper hand. That delusion would evaporate the second she walked into the courtroom and saw me sitting at the bench, gavel in hand, looking down at her not as a neighbor, but as the law she had thought she could ignore. By the time the trial entered its third day, the courtroom atmosphere had shifted from tense curiosity to a kind of electric anticipation, as though everyone in the gallery sensed that the case was about to reach a boiling point. And if the first 2 days had been about laying the groundwork, introducing the evidence, and poking holes in each other's claims, then this day was all about confrontation and exposure, with each side preparing to hit hard, not with vague accusations or speculative testimony, but with cold, unavoidable facts. And I could see it in Karen's body language the moment she walked in that morning. Gone was the smug smile she had worn on day one, replaced now by tight lips, jittery hands, and the occasional nervous glance toward her attorney, as though she was beginning to realize the walls she had thought would protect her were now closing in. My own lawyer, Dan, was calm but sharp, his thick binder already open in front of him, each page tabbed and labeled with surgical precision. And as we settled into our seats, I could hear the quiet hum of the media equipment in the back of the room, local news cameras, reporters scribbling notes, all eager for the moment when the story of local HOA president accused of arson would explode into a viral headline. The judge, an older man with an austere manner and a voice that carried like thunder, took his seat, adjusted his glasses, and wasted no time calling the court to order, motioning for the prosecution to continue their cross-examination. This was the part of the trial where all the strategic patience of the earlier sessions paid off, because the prosecution had timed it perfectly. First, they called the fire investigator back to the stand, the same man who had testified earlier about the origin of the fire in my home, but this time they walked him through a set of photographs that had not yet been shown to the jury. Close-up images of a red gas can partially hidden behind a hedge near my property line. Droplets of accelerant residue still visible under the forensic lighting and a faint fingerprint lifted from the handle. Karen's attorney immediately objected, claiming the evidence was circumstantial, but the judge overruled him after the investigator explained the direct chain of custody and the lab's confirmation of the match, a match that led directly back to Karen. I kept my eyes on her as the words sank in, watching her shoulders tighten, her gaze drop to the table. Her mouth twitched slightly as though she was suppressing the urge to shout something, but she stayed silent, no doubt, because her lawyer had warned her not to speak unless called. Next came the testimony from my neighbor across the street, who described in meticulous detail how, on the night of the fire, he had seen Karen's SUV idling near the corner just minutes before the first flames erupted, the headlights briefly cutting across my driveway before vanishing into the darkness. The defense tried to paint him as unreliable, suggesting he could have mistaken the vehicle for another, but the witness held firm, even recalling the exact make, model, and the HOA sticker on the rear window, something no other car in the neighborhood carried except for Karen's. And then came the moment we had been waiting for, the one piece of evidence that would cut through any lingering doubt like a blade through glass, the security footage. Now, Karen had spent the better part of the past year believing she had destroyed all potential video evidence by disabling my home's cameras before the fire. But what she didn't know was that the small, weatherproof trail camera I kept mounted in an oak tree by the edge of my property, originally meant for catching raccoons in my trash cans, had captured her walking along the side of my yard carrying a bag and what appeared to be the very same red gas can. When the grainy but unmistakable image appeared on the courtroom's projection screen, a ripple of murmurs swept through the jury box and the gallery, and even the judge's usually impassive expression hardened. Karen's face drained of color. Her attorney leaned forward in a desperate whisper, but it was too late. The damage was done. My lawyer let the image linger for a long, deliberate moment before moving on, allowing its weight to settle into the minds of everyone present. When it was finally Karen's turn to testify, the shift in the room was palpable. She walked to the stand with stiff, jerky movements, her voice thin and defensive, as she tried to explain that she had simply been checking the property for safety concerns that night. Don was merciless in his cross-examination, dismantling her story piece by piece, pointing out that safety inspections are not conducted at midnight carrying containers of gasoline, and reminding her that she had publicly clashed with me in multiple recorded HOA meetings over my refusal to comply with her so-called improvement mandates. Each time she stumbled over a response, I could feel the jury's sympathy slipping further away from her. But perhaps the most satisfying moment came when Don slid a printed email across the stand, an email from Karen to another HOA board member sent just 2 weeks before the fire, in which she wrote, "If he won't follow our rules, he won't have a house to follow them from." The gasps that followed were immediate and sharp, and the judge had to bang his gavel to restore order. Karen tried to claim it was a joke, but the cold, deliberate tone in her words made the claim ring hollow. By the end of her testimony, even her own attorney looked exhausted, his closing questions half-hearted, as though he already knew the jury's verdict would not be in their favor. And as I sat there watching the entire web of her arrogance, manipulation, and entitlement unravel in front of everyone, I realized that no matter what happened in the final day of trial, I had already won in the ways that mattered. The truth was out, the lies were exposed, and Karen's reign of intimidation was over. Still, part of me wanted more than just a guilty verdict. I wanted her to feel the weight of every sleepless night, every moment of loss, every flicker of flame that had torn through my life because of her petty vendetta. And as I locked eyes with her for a brief second before the judge adjourned for the day, I could see that deep down she finally understood exactly what was coming for her, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. By the time the court case entered its final stretch, the entire town was buzzing about it, reporters filling the hallway outside, news cameras parked at the curb, and neighbors who had once quietly whispered their opinions now openly taking sides, though most stood firmly behind me after the truth came spilling out like gasoline onto a fire. The evidence I had carefully assembled over months. Every little detail I had hunted down, every shred of proof, was finally being woven together in front of the judge and jury like an airtight net. And Karen, once confident and smug, now sat, stiff in her chair, eyes darting nervously between her attorney and me, her hands fidgeting with a pen as though it might somehow dig her out of the hole she had gleefully jumped into. But no one could save her from the reality that she had orchestrated the destruction of my home, convinced that the HOAS word was law, unaware that the very person she targeted had been preparing for a war in the only arena that truly mattered, the courtroom. I laid out the financial records first, showing how HOA funds had been funneled into emergency landscaping projects that never existed, tracing the transactions back to shell accounts linked to her brother-in-law, and then came the emails, the emails where she explicitly discussed my known compliance with imaginary HOA rules and suggested a permanent solution to get rid of me. Her words dripping with the arrogance of someone who thought influence and connections could rewrite reality. And when the fire investigator testified that the accelerant used on my home was the same type purchased in bulk on her HOA card just 2 weeks prior, the room went silent except for the scratching of the court stenographer's keys, every letter being locked into the official record for eternity. Her defense team scrambled to claim coincidence, but when the security footage from the neighboring property played a grainy but unmistakable image of her car creeping down my driveway in the dead of night, followed by a flicker of flames moments. Later the jury's faces hardened and even the judge leaned back in his chair, adjusting his glasses with that look judges get when they've already made up their mind but have to let the process play out. Karen's composure cracked in increments, first a twitch of her jaw, then a tightening of her lips, and finally a full-blown outburst when her own so-called allies from the HOA board were called as witnesses and, desperate to save themselves, threw her under the bus without hesitation, revealing she had acted without a formal vote, bypassed procedure, and used the association's funds and influence for personal revenge. This was the final nail. The moment I knew we'd won, but I wasn't done yet. Because while justice for the fire was critical, I had also been building a case for restitution, every personal belonging lost, every structural loss, the emotional toll, the legal costs and punitive damages for malicious intent. And when my attorney slid the final damages figure across the table, the gasp in the room was almost comical, as if the number itself carried the weight of poetic justice. The judge's ruling was swift once closing arguments were made: guilty of arson, insurance fraud, conspiracy to defraud, and misuse of HOA funds, ordered to pay me millions in compensation. Her assets seized, her position stripped, and her sentence, ensuring she would spend more time in an orange jumpsuit than in the HOA president's seat she had clung to like a throne. The day the verdict was read, I walked out of that courtroom into a wall of microphones, the flash of cameras momentarily blinding me. But I held my head high because it wasn't just my victory, it was every homeowner who had been bullied, fined, or harassed by an HOA tyrant who thought the rules applied to everyone but them. In the weeks that followed, demolition crews arrived to clear what was left of my burned home, but this time, the sound of heavy machinery wasn't accompanied by heartbreak. It was the sound of a clean slate, of rebuilding on my terms without fear of interference, because while Karen had been busy plotting my downfall, I had quietly secured full ownership of the surrounding access roads and easements, effectively giving me the final say over who even entered the neighborhood, and the remaining HOA members, terrified of further scandal, approached me with a settlement to dissolve the association entirely, handing back control to individual homeowners. I rebuilt my home stronger than before. Every beam and brick a statement that intimidation had failed. And when Karen's old house finally went up for auction to cover part of her debt to me, I made sure to attend, standing at the back with my hands in my pockets as strangers outbid each other, knowing she was watching from her cell, powerless to stop it. My lawyer joked that I should write a book about it. And maybe one day I will, but for now, I'm content knowing that the woman who once strutted around giving orders now answers to a prison guard, And every time I drive past the rebuilt gate, at the end of my driveway, I smile. Because it's more than just a gate, it's the line she crossed, the mistake she never undo, and the reminder that